I'm Jody Sanders with American Patchwork and Quilting.
And I'm Joanna Bergerino, editor of Quilts and More magazine.
Each month, we share our favorite sewing secrets, and they're being brought to you by Babylock. We're recapping our topics from the past 6 months, and we've got some great tips for you today.
That's right. From piecing to backing to quilting, we've got tips for every part of the quilting process.
First up, we have some chain piecing tips so that you can more efficiently sew your pieces together.
The most common use for chain piecing is when you're piecing multiple blocks, like these 4 patch units. So we have already pieced our pairs of squares together, and now we're going to chain piece them together. So we've layered our pairs right sides together, and now we're going to sew. To chain piece, start sewing your units together. When you get close to the edge of your first pair, get the next units ready. Sew off the end of your first units and feed the next pair through without breaking the thread. No stopping is necessary, but you may want to slow down. If you do need to stop, stop with your needle in the down position. We found it most helpful to use the 1/4 inch seam foot so we can get the most accurate seams. And if you're sewing units that already have seams like this 4 patch, it's easier to position the seam pressed toward you and away from the machine. This helps your machine foot sew easily over the seams without twisting them. Another great use for chain piecing is when you're piecing a lot of the same size squares in different colors to one color of fabric, like this white. So here we've cut our white strip the width we need, and we're going to start sewing the squares to it. As we chain piece these together, you'll add the different color squares as close together as possible on the strip, without much thread in between. Once everything is pieced, you can simply press the squares out and cut them apart. This saves both piecing and cutting time. Chain piecing is especially useful when you're piecing units with points, such as triangle squares. It helps prevent thread nests from forming at the back of your blocks and helps your points from being pulled down into your machine. Here's a great trick for chain piecing triangle squares. Sew a 1/4 inch away from the marked line on one side of a triangle square. Then offset the next triangle square and sew a 1/4 inch on the opposite sides. It nests the pieces so you're wasting less thread and can keep your pieces from bunching together. Another great use for chain piecing is when you're piecing together blocks in a very specific order or a very specific color order like we have here. It makes assembling your quilt top so much easier. Have your pieces laid out in the order you want them on the table next to you or a design wall. Put a small piece of tape labeled with the row number on the first piece in each row. Similarly, you could also add a little pin with the pin head marked with the numbers. Pick up all the pieces in order and set them in a pile. To keep your pieces organized when you're chain piecing, you want to grab the first of the pair you're sewing and put it right side up, and then the second right side down on top of it. And you'll continue with this method while you're chain piecing. Once you have your blocks chain pieced together, we can separate the rows. So find your tape pieces where you marked the rows, and then we can just snip the thread in between the rows. So this is your row 1. Because you always pieced with the first of each pair on the bottom, you know exactly how to rearrange your row in the right order. We hope that these 4 chain piecing techniques make your sewing faster and easier.
I love to chain piece my blocks. You can also pick up the entire chain to bring to the ironing board for pressing before cutting the pieces apart. It's a great way to keep all your pieces together and save some time.
Now, the next subject is my favorite. I love to make mini quilts with teeny tiny pieces. You can see a couple of them that I've made recently here with some small pieces. One of the things that you want to keep in mind is that when you do small and mini quilts, you want to have a small scale print or like a tone on tone, because those kind of prints work better for minis. If you're cutting into small pieces, it helps maintain that look of the fabric.
We love minis at Quilts and More too. In each issue, we take one of the patterns and make it mini. So here's the one from our upcoming Fall 2019 issue, where I took just a portion of a larger quilt and turned it into a cute little zipper bag. So one thing to consider if you're taking an existing pattern and making it smaller is the size that you want your finished project to be. So I didn't take the whole quilt, I just miniaturized a portion of it because I wanted my bag to be this particular size.
Check out this next clip with more tips for making mini quilts. Now, for some people, the 6x12 inch ruler is a pretty common ruler to have that you would use to do cutting. But when you're making smaller mini quilts, I would suggest getting smaller rulers that you can use. So like this is a 4.5 inch, we've got a small flying geese ruler, we've got a little 2.5 inch square, and that will help you when you're trying to cut those small pieces. So in addition to the rulers, you're also going to want to scale down your rotary cutter. There's two sizes here on the table. The 45mm is the larger one, and that's the one that most people probably have and use. There is also a 28mm, and that's the smaller one, and that's really nice for cutting small pieces. I'm going to set these aside. The next thing you might want to look at is getting a small mat. And this is really nice because in addition to just being smaller scale, you can easily set it by your sewing machine and do cutting there if you want. It also turns really easily on the table, so you can turn the mat to finish up your cutting. And then you don't have to worry about turning your pieces and maybe losing some accuracy. So these small mats are really nice. There's also a mat pressing combo. So this is actually really nice for working on small blocks. This side is for pressing, and then this side is for cutting. Now that you have everything cut, you're ready to start sewing. And here's a few tips when using your sewing machine. Number one, you might want to switch out to a 1/4 inch foot. That will help you with your accuracy. When you're making small quilts, it's really important to have a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you vary even a little bit, if you multiply that in the little pieces that you're making, it's really going to make a difference. So having that 1/4 inch seam allowance foot on there is really, really going to be helpful. The other thing you might want to do is put on the straight stitch throat plate. So in this case, you can see there's just one little dot up toward the top here. That means your needle is just going down that one small hole. Sometimes when we have small pieces and we're putting them through to sew, that fabric gets caught down in there and that can cause problems. So if you switch out to the straight stitch throat plate, you'll alleviate some of those problems that you might have. You also might want to shorten your stitch length just a little bit, not too much, but just enough so that when you're working with those small pieces, it catches them a little more often than it would if you have a little longer stitch length. And finally, if you don't have a stiletto, this is called an orange stick, and you can find it in the area of your drugstore that has like nail polish. It's actually used with manicures. It's got a little pointed end on it, and this is great for helping to guide through your fabrics as you're putting them through to sew. So now you've got your little quilt top all sewn together, and I want to give you a couple of tips for finishing your mini quilts. Number one, take a look at the batting that you'll be using. You want to use something probably thin, so something like a thin cotton, or even flannel works really well. You don't want to use like a high loft poly because it's just not going to look very good with those small mini quilts. Also think about your quilting design. You'll want to do something that's fairly simple and not too overwhelming. Putting a big feather wreath on this small quilt just wouldn't complement it very well. So having very simple lines, you can do some wavy lines. Just do something that accentuates that small quilt and doesn't detract from it. You also want to look at your binding. On small quilts, probably do a single fold binding instead of a double fold binding. That just lets it lay a little flatter. And in this case, in addition to the single fold binding, I've also made my binding, I've cut it a little narrower to start with. So I have a little narrower binding, which again fits the scale better of the little mini quilt. So I hope these tips and tools will help you when you get ready to do some of your own tiny sewing. Sometimes I think we forget to explore all the features on our sewing machine. I know that I'm guilty of using just the straight stitch most of the time. But in this next clip, we're going to show you some other fun options. So check out these 5 great stitches for sewing and quilting.
Our first stitch is a reinforcement stitch or a stay stitch. It's this little open circle button on the crescendo. This stitch will sew 3 stitches in the same spot to lock your seam, as opposed to a back stitch, which adds an additional line of thread. For character or decorative stitches, when you press this button, the design will end with a full stitch instead of in the middle of your design. The next helpful stitch is a basting stitch. It's automatically set up for an extra long stitch, which is meant to hold pieces in place before sewing them together. They're easy to rip out if they end up showing in your finished piece. This stitch is also great for creating ruffles because the long stitches are easy to pull to create the gather. A basting stitch is also the perfect way to secure the edge of an unfinished quilt top. This is especially useful if your top will sit unfinished for a while. And once you're ready to quilt, the basting stitch will ensure those seams close to the edges won't come apart. Another workhorse stitch is the zigzag stitch. This is a versatile stitch that is great for applique, but also helps keep raw edges from fraying if you don't have a serger. On some home decor projects especially, we recommend stitching a zigzag stitch between the raw edges and your seam to give your projects an extra layer of security. And don't forget about the 3-step zigzag stitch or the elastic stitch. This zigzag takes extra stitches to create a zigzag stitch that will still stretch with the fabric and prevents tunneling. This is perfect for sewing with knits and other stretchy fabrics. We also like to use it to join batting pieces. If you enjoy quilting your own projects, consider using the serpentine stitch. This is one of my favorites because it's just as easy as straight stitching, but gives a little more movement and texture to your finished quilt. Try shortening or lengthening the stitch to create different looks. I especially love to use this when I am quilting small projects. The final stitch I want to share with you gives the appearance of hand stitching, but without all the work. This is basically a running stitch, however the difference is that it goes back over every other stitch. This creates the look of hand stitching. The trick is to use a clear or monofilament thread on top and a regular thread in your desired color in the bobbin.
And here's another tip when you're trying out new threads or maybe needles, or maybe you have a new machine and you need to try out the stitches that you have, do a stitch sampler. Just put a couple of pieces of fabric together with some batting, and you can try out some different stitches, different lengths, different widths, and you could even take a micron pen if you wanted to and write directly on here what the stitch and the length was, so when you go back to use it another time, you know exactly what to reset it for.
Yeah, it's a great tip, especially if you come back and forth to your projects a few different times. The serpentine stitch is also a great one for finishing quilts quickly. I like to use it for even all over quilting sometimes, and it just really helps you finish your projects quickly. Speaking of fast, a great way to get backing pieces together quickly is by using your serger. So you can cut and sew the backing together at one time, and it just saves so much time. So here are a few more great backing tips.
So today we're talking about quilt backs. There's no need for them to be boring. We're going to give you some tips and tricks for piecing your quilt back. So some ideas for pieced backs are using leftover blocks from the front of your quilt or just leftover fabric. It's a great way to tie in the front of your quilt with the back and gives you a fun reversible design. Another thing to think about is using those larger prints that you don't want to cut up and lose that fun design, or even panels are great on your backing as well. And if you're not very confident in your machine quilting, use a busy print on the back, then your stitches will blend right in. When you're piecing backing, you're often working with really big pieces and their width of fabric usually. You definitely want to remove the selvage edge because that's usually a tighter weave and you don't want that in your backing fabric. So a serger makes really quick work of this task because you're cutting and finishing at the same time. So we've set up the machine with a 4-thread overlock stitch, and I have put a couple pins in our backing pieces just to hold them together, but they're well out of the seam allowance. And now we'll just serge down this entire piece. So serging gives you a really quick way to finish this off, and bonus, it's really secure and the seam lays nice and flat. A couple more things to keep in mind. You should have your backing be 4 inches larger than your quilt top on all sides to allow for a little extra wiggle room. And if you're planning on long arming your quilt, the seam should run horizontally on your quilt. So when you're loading it onto the long arm, it's parallel to the bars. This allows for better loading and a smoother backing. And one more thing, usually when you're finished with your quilt, you're gonna fold it in half. So if you can avoid the center with your seams, that is preferable. It will weaken your quilt over time as you fold it in that same spot. So those are our tips for better backing using your serger.
Okay, here's one more backing idea. Use those oops blocks that you've made in the backing and make it a label. Here, our coworker Beth had one block that didn't turn out correctly. So instead of tossing it, she pieced it into the backing and wrote the quilt information on it. Adding the extra fabrics from the front creates a fun design between the 2 larger pieces of the backing.
Once you've completed your backing, it's time to quilt. And I've got some great tips for you on how to finish a t-shirt quilt. First, let's talk about prepping the quilt sandwich. You'll want to iron the seams of your quilt top open to avoid extra bulk while quilting. Make sure to pre-wash your backing fabric because t-shirts have generally been washed and dried many times and will not shrink. Therefore, washing your backing fabric before quilting will keep your quilt from looking too puckered. Because of this, you're going to want to purchase slightly more backing fabric to account for any shrinkage. There are a few things to consider when choosing batting. T-shirts can be heavy, so a thin 100% cotton batting will keep the weight down if that's a concern. Check the batting label to see how densely you need to machine quilt your quilt. If you won't be quilting larger areas of the quilt due to logos and t-shirt designs that might feature heavy plastic, you want to make sure your batting type supports that. Most batting calls for stitches 4 to 10 inches apart, so choose accordingly. Next, it's time to baste your quilt top. Be liberal with your basting pins or basting spray if you prefer to use that. Knits stretch very easily, so avoid distortion by taking the time to baste correctly. If you're using t-shirts in a variety of colors, consider using a cream or gray thread to machine quilt, which will blend in with most of the colors in your fabric. Or try a variegated thread. This one that I have here happens to have blue, green, and purple, which matches well with the colors in these particular t-shirts. Now we're ready to quilt. I like to start by stitching in the ditch to keep the blocks in place. So use your walking foot to evenly feed all the layers of the quilt and to avoid distorting the knit top. Start from the center and work your way out to the edge. Be sure to smooth the quilt as you go so no puckers develop. You may want to avoid quilting through the heavy plastic parts of the t-shirt design. You'll have a hard time quilting through it, and it could leave holes or even damage the t-shirt design. Consider echoing around the design and then filling the remaining part of the t-shirt with a stipple or other fill design. If you find you need more grip on your quilt top, you may want to try using machine quilting gloves. The logo or shirt design will pop if you quilt densely in the open space around the design, which gives a nice focal point to your quilt. So those are my tips for finishing a t-shirt quilt.
And we have one more tip for you. The wishbone design is one that looks great and sashing, and Joanna's going to demonstrate this for you.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite designs. It's fairly easy for a beginner. It helps you practice curves, and you can just think of it as a stretched out figure 8 as you go back and forth across your sashing strip.
T-shirt quilts are such a fun way to turn those memories into a lasting keepsake. Our last and final topic is tips for sewing triangle squares together. We've got 6 great tips to show you next.
Our first tip is to make your initial squares 1/8 of an inch larger than your pattern calls for. Then sew them together, and then you can trim them up to the finished size. So these are 2-inch finished. Then you can line up your 45-degree line on your ruler with the center line of your triangle square and then trim it on the two sides here. Then turn it around and do the same thing. And this will ensure that you get a perfect triangle square with that line going right down the center. It does take a little extra time, but we really feel like the precision is worth it. Our second tip is to use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So the distance that you're sewing away from your marked line should just be a tiny bit smaller than a 1/4 inch. This scant 1/4 inch seam allowance will give you the few extra threads you need to get precise triangle squares. We recommend you still check the size and, if necessary, square up the block. If you're having trouble with your points getting eaten by your machine, you can switch out for a straight stitch plate. It has a smaller opening for the needle, so there's not as much room for that fabric to get pulled down into your machine. Our third tip is, if you're struggling with accuracy, instead of marking the diagonal line and sewing a 1/4 inch away from it, go ahead and just mark a 1/4 inch from the center and sew on the lines. Our next tip is pressing matters. Set the seams by pressing on top of the stitching lines. This helps the stitching sink into the fabric, so when you press the triangle square open, you have a clean, straight line diagonally through the square. To make it easier to join multiple triangle squares together, you'll want to cut off the dog ears. Now, if you are using the make the triangle squares larger method that we talked about as our first tip, then you already have done this. And finally, when you're sewing your triangle square units together, using a leader and ender strip to start with can help you get a nice start on your pieces, especially when you have a bunch of bulk right at the beginning of your triangle square units. So next time you're sewing triangle squares, give these tips a try.
I typically make my triangle squares larger and trim them down to size just because I find for me they're a little more accurate that way. What's your favorite tip for triangle squares, Jody?
Well, if you're still having some trouble after you've tried our tips, I think a block lock ruler, sometimes it's a tool that you need to kind of help you out a little bit. And this particular tool is a great one for getting those triangle squares just right. It's got a little bit of a ridge in here, and you just nestle up your triangle square diagonal seam along that, and then it helps you trim, make those accurate triangle squares. Well, those are our sewing secrets for today. We'll be sharing more fun tips and techniques in the upcoming months.
Thanks so much for joining us.